The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents an interview with Ozymandias Ramses II. I have to say that this is probably one of the discussions and interviews that I've been most eagerly anticipating doing. It's kind of strange, though. I don't fit in necessarily with the YouTube community, although my content's posted to YouTube, but I interact with members of that community on occasion. This gentleman's influence on how I think has been significant. We've had a number of discussions. He's helped kind of refine and tweak my views on logical absolutes, epistemology, various other issues in philosophy. He's the only person who saw preview comments of what I intended to say in my debate with Cy, which is also the only time I've ever asked anyone to preview any comments. I don't want to be parroting anybody. I want to give my own thoughts, and I don't want to, necessarily be coached. And it wasn't so much that I was like, oh, I'm terribly worried that I'm wrong. We developed this kind of online relationship based entirely on respectful, thoughtful, insightful comments and a shared interest in the topics there. And the other curious thing is that I don't even know what his real name is. It's unfortunate that he lives so far away from me that we don't get to interact in person ever. But the interview discussion, which is long overdue, here he is, Ozymandias Ramses.
Good morning.
How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you very much. That was a really generous introduction. Thank you so much for that.
It's true, and it's one of those things that I've found is actually extra curious. There are, you could go read this book, whether you're reading, Swinburne on theology or Hume or Quine or someone on philosophy, and you get the sense of, oh, here's a person and they're in this position of authority. In real terms, you could just be some random nobody, or could have been, who contacted me, and I could have just, shrugged it off, oh, whatever. But it was very obvious the way that the comments that you made, the way that you phrased them. I've loved the educational efforts that you've done on YouTube, and it's been helpful to me. So there are, though, perhaps a couple areas where we might still have some disagreement, and we might get to some of those. But we were also talking about debates, and that's the entire purpose of the Atheist Debates project, is to try to, make sure that we're preparing people, giving them good tools, and pointing out the differences between, an informal one-on-one discussion and an online argument where there may be an audience, and then a formal debate. But right before we went on air, we were discussing one of my upcoming debates, and I figure you raised a question, which I want to address. But before we get to it, why don't you give everybody a little background on yourself to the extent that you're comfortable doing so?
Sure. Well, my YouTube handle is Ozymandias Ramses II. I describe myself as an atheist, or a provisional atheist. I'm from Canada, and my background is in contemporary analytic philosophy. That's what I studied in university and in grad school, and I got to teach some of that when I was a grad student. I am not a philosopher, though. I'm not affiliated with a university. I don't have a PhD in philosophy or anything like that, although I did go to grad school to study it with aspiring to be a philosopher. And so my background is in analytic philosophy, specifically epistemology, and with an interest in philosophy of science, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind. Those are the areas that I'm most interested in. More recently, I've become a little interested in questions of having to do with ethics and moral philosophy. And my participation in the Great Debate on YouTube and on Google+, and a little less so on Facebook, has been mostly to try to help those of us in the skeptical, free thought atheist community to up our game, to help us sort of disabuse ourselves of bad counter apologetics, and embrace what I think are better epistemological principles. Because as I see it, the real problem that confronts us is not specifically theism or religion. I mean, these are, theism and religion are large umbrella terms, and some religions are worse than others. But the real enemy, as I see it, is irrationality, superstitious thinking, and dogmatism. And there's still plenty of irrationality and dogmatism among those who have tumbled out of their faith, as I did. I was a religious person growing up, and you don't suddenly acquire a PhD in critical thinking just because you've tumbled out of your faith. So just by virtue of the fact that you become an atheist, for instance, you're not necessarily better equipped to argue for your own position and argue against the position of other people. And I think that if there is an enterprise in the online that has to do with atheism, right, the so-called atheist community, if there's any value in that, it's to the extent that it promotes critical thinking, skepticism, rationality, and embraces scientific values. I think that is what is sort of at the heart, what is a value in this online movement. And I've been trying to inject myself in this discourse to promote that. The contribution that I've been trying to make within the Great Debate with my YouTube channel, both with my YouTube channel and appearances on such as the Magic Sandwich Show and that sort of thing, has been to try to promote critical thinking, rationality, skepticism, and embracing scientific values. My feeling is you get atheism and agnosticism as a byproduct of those things, so that I don't have to agitate specifically for atheism. I don't have to be an evangelist for atheism. That's not necessary. I think if you sort of evangelize and promote and inculcate the values that I just described, you get atheism and agnosticism for free. You will get people tending away towards religiosity and dogmatism and superstition.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I've said similar, and actually come under fire a little bit from some skeptics. But you mentioned something that I really have to ask you, just because I'm curious, and it's a difficult question to phrase. So you're not a philosopher. I'm definitely not a philosopher. I have a keen interest in it. I've read some stuff, but my interest in philosophy only extends in a pragmatic sense, and to the extent that I want to know enough so that I am able to address the arguments, discuss the issues, have an understanding of the various problems, not be overstating things. But I have as my goal this promotion, the same as you, the promotion of critical thinking and rationality, which I think is going to, potentially eliminate bad thinking, superstition, religion, all of it. But I have friends who are concerned that the more professional philosophers, or the people who are spending so much time studying all the specifics about philosophy, might get so bogged down in what they've studied and the vernacular and the language of it, that not only do they talk over people's heads, so that they tend to lose an audience in a discussion because they're being they're being precise and they're being erudite, and I wouldn't fault them for that, but they're not particularly good at communicating in a way that everybody understands. But there's a concern that they might also, because of their investment in a particular ideology, but that their goal is to show that philosophy actually backs up their ideology, that this might make them immune to critical examination of those ideas. I mean, can you be too well versed in philosophy for your own damn good? I guess is the question.
Well, yeah, I suppose, in the same sense that you can be too well versed in evolutionary biology and that sort of thing, so that you become incapable of communicating the evidence for evolutionary theory. I mean, I have known people who were exquisitely knowledgeable on the subject of evolutionary theory, but couldn't talk to someone who was a creationist and put forward the case for why we believe in common descent and Darwinian principles. So yeah, I mean, that can absolutely happen. You can become so invested in a discourse, adopt the idioms of that discourse and those ways of speaking, that you effectively insulate yourself from having meaningful discourse with other people. And I mean, philosophy, I mean, I try not to agitate for philosophy. I don't try to promote philosophy per se. I think that the best way to advertise philosophy is to show what, in ordinary discussions and conversations and arguments and debates, the benefits of philosophy, which is critical thinking. Philosophy, if it's about anything, philosophy is about clarity of thought. It's about precision and rigor and specificity and recognizing relevant distinctions avoiding fallacies, which means recognizing fallacies, which means knowing fallacies, which it means embracing the correct epistemic norms or principles of rationality that should govern how we think and how we acquire our beliefs. I mean, philosophy, among other things, is preoccupied with principles of rational belief acquisition and belief revision, and so I think, to the extent that you're undertaking a philosophy seriously, you are undertaking the process of understanding how you acquire your beliefs, how beliefs ought to be acquired, when they should be rejected, when they should be revised, and so forth. But it is indeed very, very possible to sort of forget about what that particular goal of philosophy is and just get mired in the jargon of a particular question, in the philosophy of mind, or a particular question in epistemology, or a particular question in ethics, and then just be incapable of communicating that to other people. Yeah, so I mean that is a risk. That is a liability, and unfortunately, there's so much of that problem that you're describing going on that a lot of people in the skeptical community are allergic to philosophy. They don't appreciate that. Wait a minute. Yeah, that's all mumbo jumbo, right? And well, part of that is fueled by the fact that so much of religious apologetics reaches back in the history of philosophy and mines it, cafeteria style. They pick and choose whatever little bits of argument that they can cobble together to confect a defense of the faith. But that is doing philosophy in reverse. That is reverse engineering arguments to get to a conclusion. I mean, if philosophy is about anything, it is about the examination of our belief set and looking at where the evidence points. I mean, philosophy is not antithetical to the consultation of evidence. Philosophy starts from looking at the evidence and saying, what can we make of this? As I said before, they're doing philosophy in reverse engineering an argument. They make things incredibly complicated. They dress things up in formal logic to try to create the illusion of rigor and specificity where it isn't necessarily there. And where the arguments don't actually persuade them. They're already persuaded of the conclusion. They're just confecting arguments after the fact, shoring up. This is rationalization, plain and simple, when this goes on. Now, of course, it's not only theists that do this. Atheists are guilty of this kind of thing too.
I think I might be slightly more charitable about this than you are. Maybe not. I can't read people's minds, so I know that there are apologists who probably are intentionally trying to deceive people. There are apologists who, as far as I can tell, believe, and I can't read their minds to know whether or not they do. And so when you have this situation where somebody like Craig, for example, has said he believes on behalf of the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, but he understands that that's not going to be a compelling argument for anybody else. And so he's coming up with arguments which are consistent with his belief, which he thinks should be convincing, but aren't necessarily why he believes. I don't see anything remotely dishonest in there as an attempt to deceive anybody else. But I think that there's likely to be an issue of self-deception involved, and because you're beginning with a conclusion and working to have something fit it.
Yeah, well, no, I agree with that completely. I'm not of the view that most apologists are going around self-consciously, intentionally being dishonest and putting forward bogus arguments. I mean, no doubt there are some people who do that. There are people who will do that on any issue. I mean, just look at politics, right? People will be, will often exploit a person's ignorance of a certain issue and try to hit them with an argument in order to bamboozle them quite deliberately. I think that in the main, when people put forward arguments in the great debate on all sides, if they often misjudge an argument and think it's convincing and think that it would convince them, and then if it's failing to convince the other person, it's because the other person is being stubborn. So when I say that that this is philosophy being done in reverse, what I mean is that there's just this cognitive bias operative here. It's unwitting. It is a kind of self-deception. No doubt I'm prone to it, as anybody is. But I don't think that people are going around trying to bamboozle people, right? I mean, there are occasions where I judge a person, where the principle of charity fails me, and I just think, no, like I don't believe that you actually believe this. But those are actually very rare occasions. I think that most people when they put forward an apologetic or a counter apologetic, sincerely think that it ought to persuade the other person, and they're just not recognizing that they're engaged in a kind of confirmation bias, that they're just casting about for any argument that they can in support of a favored conclusion, right? Or casting about for an objection to an argument that they look upon with disapproval, right? I mean, I think we all do this. And I think when the stakes are high and you've invested an awful lot in a view, as is the case when you're positing gods and salvation and damnation and stuff like that, when your entire structure of values is organized around certain views, certain dogmas, then of course that's extremely likely to happen.
The other high impact aspect of this is that they've made a public profession of their beliefs, and so that adds to the investment. I've said before, it's slightly exaggerative. I'm pretty much convinced there's not a single person on the planet who has come to believe in any God, let alone a Christian God, based on the transcendental argument for the existence of God. It's just not how people get to that belief,
right?
Instead, how people attempt to justify that belief to others who didn't come through the path that they did. But you had said something, and I didn't want to forget about it. Right before the interview started, we were talking about the upcoming debate that I'm doing, and you asked me an incredibly interesting question that I think would be valuable for the Atheist Debates project. You asked me if Blake and I had submitted our opening remarks to each other, or if we were going to submit our opening remarks to each other prior to the debate. We have not. I don't plan to do that. I have some objections to it, but it's not necessarily out of the question. And I thought it'd probably, maybe you could explain what your thoughts on this are and why.
Okay. Well, I should preface it by saying that I don't do debates. People who've seen me in videos, who've seen me in Hangouts, who've seen me on discussion panels, know that I like to have open-ended discussions and conversations. I certainly get into arguments with people, and I'm prepared to argue fairly vociferously for my own position or against another position, depending which position is on the table. But I don't do formal structured debates. And the reason I don't is not because I disapprove of debates in general. It's just because I play to my strengths. Some people are good at debating. Debating is an art form, and people get better at it as they practice it, but some people just sort of are naturally good at it. I think you're really quite skilled at it. William Lane Craig is certainly very masterful at it. I mean, being a good debatist involves knowing how to present your brief, your case, in a way that is digestible to an audience of coming from varied backgrounds who won't necessarily have knowledge of a specific vocabulary. So you've got to sort of cast your net wide. You got to go deep enough, but you've got to say it quickly and easily. You have to be able to anticipate what your opponent is likely to say. And you have to think, you have to be really nimble. You have to think fast on the fly. You got to be able to detect a flaw in an argument that you might not have heard before, or be able to raise an objection in real time. And it has to be concise. And anyone who's seen my videos and heard me talk knows that I lack concision. I tend to be long-winded. This is evidence.
In the same boat, yes.
Yeah. Well, no, you're not long-winded like I'm long-winded. I mean, I've heard you in debates, and you have a way of translating difficult concepts in a way that is succinct and easy on the ear, and can be easily digested and easily repeated, so that people can export it, take it out, and remember it. Right? You do that with the Atheist Experience show all the time. In fact, in our
note though, before we get to the point where people think I invited you on here just so you could praise me.
No.
That's not the reason why, but I appreciate it.
Okay, well, no, but I'm contrasting you because you do debates all the time, and I never do debates, and I'm trying to explain why I don't, and it's because I couldn't do what you do. I would suck at it. It just takes me too long to build a ramp to get to my conclusion, and in real time in a debate, that's not going to work. But there are things that I don't like about debates, and there are kinds of debates that I don't like, and kinds of debates that I do like, and a lot of people have weird ideas about debates. One of the things I don't like about debates is that you get two people that present their positions, and then afterwards everyone just sort of keeps a scorecard, and they effectively declare that the proponent of their view won the debate, right? That's how people see these things.
Sure.
And okay, that's human nature. That's just bias talking. Of course, that's going to happen. But I think that one of the things that's unfortunate about debates within the great debate community is that people have a tendency to think that an issue gets settled by debates, that this is somehow what goes on in universities and in academic disciplines, and that this is how things get sorted out. And that's absolutely not what goes on. Yes, debates are conducted in universities, but those are like exhibition matches, right? That's all that goes on there, right? Nothing gets settled in science or in English departments or philosophy departments or history departments when two people come together and put forward their arguments. That is something that is done for the edification of an audience, right? To inform them. And so debates can be very, very informative, especially when a person is new to an area of discourse. That can be fantastic. But nothing gets settled this way, right? Things get settled in peer-reviewed journals and conferences, and slowly a consensus builds, right? So debates.
That's why some of the best scientific communicators, so the best scientists don't necessarily become the best science communicators, and even the best science communicators don't necessarily become the best debaters. I'm largely in agreement with you. Actually, I've been trying to change the way debates, at least within our realm, are done, so that it's much less a joint press conference, to borrow from West Wing again, but more of a discussion. Although I'm a little bit in disagreement in this idea of saying that debates aren't how we settle things in other endeavors. I think it just depends on what your perception of debate is. Because for me, this idea of each side presenting its case and trying to point out the flaws in that is at least comparable to peer review process. And if we were to sit down, to discuss the merits and do philosophy, you would have these sort of, perhaps hopefully Socratic interactions. It's just this notion of debate as combat. And so we talk about somebody like William Lane Craig, who's, is anybody who would say that he's not actually one of the best debaters on behalf of Christendom. I don't know what planet you're on. My problem with Bill is that I think that he's formulaic, and I think that he enters debates with a structured strategy of, this is what he tends to speak first. He'll say, this is what I'm going to tell you, and this is what my opponent must do to win. Over and over again, he'll give his opening statement, and then his opponent gets up to give their opening statement. And then in Bill's first rebuttal, he'll say, we didn't hear my opponent mention A, B, C, D, or E.
Right.
Giving the impression that his opponent failed to rebut his points, when in fact his opponent's rebuttal round hasn't even started yet.
Yeah, I've noticed that. Yeah,
I anticipate that if I'm in a position to debate Craig, which I may well be at some point, there are people actively working on it. If he does that, my first rebuttal round is going to start with, not only do I not have to do what he told you I had to do in order to win the debate, I don't necessarily look at this as winning. And I find it strange that a formidable debater like Craig would criticize my opening statement for not being a sufficient rebuttal when I just now started my rebuttal. And I think opposing that goes a long way.
Yeah, I agree with that. But to sort of drill down more specifically to the question you're asking about how debates should be conducted, I think the debates sort of emulate that peer review process that we were talking about to the extent that everything is out in the open. So I favor debates where there's only one proposition on the table, first of all, right?
Versus a question. Do you have a problem with debates that have a question?
Well, yeah, it's better if it's stated as a proposition, and one person has to defend the proposition and the other person just has to critique it. Yeah. If you go in with position A and I go in with position B, all right, that's different than if you go in with position A and my job is simply to undermine position A, right? Exactly. Whereas if we're going in with, because when you have position A and position B, I'm pro-abortion and the other guy's anti-abortion. The other person is, thinks there is a God. I go in there arguing that there's no God. Okay, there's actually two debates going on there, right? I have to present my case. The other person has to present his or her case. Then we each have to attack one another's cases. Every minute that you spend shoring up your own argument and building your case is a minute that you didn't spend arguing against the other person, and hence not responding to their arguments, right? And so you have this choice. So I think it's best when a debate is conducted in such a way that there isn't sort of an open question, but there's a proposition on the table, and one person is defending or affirming the proposition, and the other person is not necessarily offering the opposite, but simply offering a criticism of the arguments for the proposition.
And this will get us a little later to the discussion of a distinction between weak and strong atheism, or atheism and non-theism.
Sure.
But on, because we'll talk all day about this, the issue of whether or not you should share opening statements. What are the benefits of that, and why would you be looking for something like that?
Well, that's where it really emulates. That's what I was going to say next. This is where it really emulates sort of a more academic process. When you share opening statements, you're not going in blind. I'll give you an example. When I was a grad student, when I was working on my master's, I presented a paper at a conference, and it was my first conference. I'd never been to I'd been to conferences, but I'd never participated in a conference. And what unfolded was exactly what happens at most conferences. You submit a paper, it gets accepted or rejected by a committee. A reviewer is assigned to read your paper and write a commentary on it, a rebuttal. That's what happened. That gentleman had my paper, and then he sent me his rebuttal. Okay, and so we each knew what the other was going to say so we both had our opening statements. So when I went up there and I presented my paper to the audience, he already had a written reply, and I knew what his reply was. So then I could respond to his reply, and then we had a conversation. We had a discussion in front of everyone. And this is how these things should go, ideally, in my view, so that you don't blindside someone. Because if I have time to evaluate your argument, I can offer an informed critique of your argument. And so my opponent is going to have the benefit of the best possible critique that I can muster, assuming I took the time to read it carefully and think about it and write a proper rebuttal. And so that would be of greater benefit to the audience. They get not only two well thought out positions, but two well thought out rebuttals. Whereas when people just have to rebut one another on the fly by the seat of their pants, hearing the argument for the first time, you can miss stuff. I'll give you an example here. What's that?
It's more about performance at that point.
That's right. And that's where skill comes in, so that nimbleness of mind that I don't have. I couldn't do that.
Oh, did I lose you?
Yeah, sorry, you disappeared for a sec. You're back now. But I'll give you an example, actually. When you had your debate with Cy, in his opening statement, he floated an argument that had a first premise, which was it's rational to believe that which is true. It's reasonable to believe that which, yeah. And I mean, I was watching that, and in the first 5 minutes, I went, "Oh, that's a ridiculous premise. It's absolutely indefensible." But you missed it, yeah. But I mean, this is what I did for a living, right? I mean, epistemology is what I did for a living for a time, right? So of course I heard that, and all the alarm bells went off, right? But had you had time to think about it, right? But there you were in the heat of the moment. You were concentrating on presenting what you needed to present and anticipating what he was going to say. You had no idea he was going to say this. You had no time to think about it, And so, how much better a debate could it have gone if each of you had had one another's opening statements and then intelligently responded to those opening statements? I mean, it would have been better for you. It would have been a better debate. Everything sort of, that is a kind of a common enterprise, right? And that's debate as collaboration. We're both sort of engaged in a kind of disinterested pursuit of the truth here and the edification of the audience, as opposed to a showdown, a wrestling match, a WWF style, head-to-head contest where you just try to humiliate or pwn the other person. And that's one of the problems I have with debates. Is there too much like that? And I think
I agree with that. I would actually like to try that at some point, because there's no denying, and I talked about this in the debate review. As soon as the audience member went up during the Q&A to question Sai's first premise. As soon as he opened his mouth to question the first premise, before he ever even said what it was, I played it back in my head and I was like, oh, wow, how did I miss that?
Yeah.
And I think in this case, it was very, very easy to miss, not only because it's something that intuitively feels reasonable, but his second premise was so obviously an issue. It is true that God exists was his second premise. That it was easier to go down that route. The thing that I do have concern about, in the realm of arguments, for example, for the existence of God or these theological debates, I'm not aware of anything that would be considered a truly new or novel idea. We've not only have we categorized and labeled the arguments, but we labeled versions of the arguments. And somebody shows up and they're presenting a cosmological argument and their version of the Kalam cosmological argument. I don't necessarily need to know that I need that in advance. And as somebody who's done a TV show for 11 years and a whole bunch of videos in addition to that and debates, I think anybody who doesn't anticipate a little bit of what my rebuttal is going to be probably just didn't do their homework. The reason that I might be maybe opposed to this sharing of opening statements and rebuttals ahead of time is not because I'm overly concerned about losing a debate. I have a particular view about the way debates go, and I'm looking at it from the standpoint of the audience. And one of the things that I want the audience to see, which is why I want more cross-examination and Q&A time, where I give a 5-10 minute opening statement each and then talk for an hour, because I like making people think. I like being made to think. I like seeing how people respond to questions that they weren't necessarily anticipating, because it lets you know, are they just regurgitating some rote explanation that they've heard said 100 times and perhaps haven't thought about? Or are they actually considering the proposition, evaluating it, and giving an honest assessment? Because I understand that we're not going to get to the truth of the matter of whether a God exists in a debate. But we are going to get to which of these two individuals representing their position is actually thinking about this, has put in the time to understand the subjects, and can respond to perhaps an out of the blue type question, because that tells you something about not only their level of understanding of the subject, and of course how well they can think on the fly, which is not in any way, supportive of whether or not what they believe is true. But we know about, mirror neurons and empathy. And when you see the person up there who holds the same view that you do, and they are unable to defend it, and they're unable to defend it any better than you are, sitting there, that feeling of discomfort is what I'm going for, because I think that it's necessary to get people to reevaluate their position. And it's just the same for me. I'm invested in a particular view, and there needs to be perhaps some nudge, some shock, so the audience member will feel the potential embarrassment. And it's not really the right word. It's not, but there is. I'm not sure there is a right word.
Well, no, there's a cognitive dissonance that happens in a conversation. That's why I favor conversations. You can have an open-ended conversation on a subject, and it can be quite pointed, and two people really, butting heads over something. But when you hit a person with an objection that is quite forceful, and when you think about it, whoa, that's an obvious objection, and the other person clearly does not have a response at all, clearly hasn't thought about it, right? That sets up cognitive dissonance in the other person. And everyone who is watching, who is sympathetic with that person's view, feels that cognitive dissonance. Like, oh, they then start thinking, how would I answer that? And I'm curious to see how he or she will answer that. Right. And that, I think, has value. And that is the drama that people enjoy out of a debate. But I think that you can get that out of a good heated conversation. Since I suck at debates, I'm going to stick with conversations.
I'm with you, and I want the debates to be more conversation. Like, I had a great conversation after the show on Sunday. There was a gentleman originally from France who lives in Houston who came down to challenge me on an issue about how I talk about morality and what the definition is, and he had his own model. And we had a great discussion, which, at least for the people sitting around us at the table, was beneficial. There were, I think it would have gone very differently if we had known each other's position ahead of time and dug in, rather than having it presented kind of on the spot. And that sort of conversation in the one-on-one thing, not having that preparation, meant that when I asked him a question that I thought exposed a problem with his view, he felt the impact of the cognitive dissonance that the audience would normally have felt, because he hadn't had an opportunity to think through this. Now, I don't know that we can say necessarily which is better, or that there's great differences here, especially since I'm agreeing with you that I wish the debates about, gods and the Bible and supernatural, in that realm, I wish they were more conversational. I wish it was, not so much the joint press conference that I like to keep around.
Yeah, well, actually, there's one debate. We were talking about William Lane Craig, and in the context of how debates should be conducted, as you said, Craig is sort of quite masterful in his debates, because he has a tendency to control the playing field. He will dictate, this is what my opponent must accomplish in order to support his position and defeat mine, right? And this is how we are to interpret the question, and so forth, right? And he's very, very good at doing that. And sometimes he corrals people that way. But you get him in a conversation, and it goes quite differently. Like, he did a debate with on whether or not God was required for morality, for objective moral values and so forth, with Shelley Kagan. And that was sort of they each gave an opening presentation, and then they just sat down in chairs and looked at each other and talked, and there was a moderator, but it was just a conversation. And I thought Craig did quite poorly there compared to how he ordinarily does. But it's because he wasn't able to sort of control his time in the way that he normally does, and he had to think on his feet, and it didn't go quite so well. Some people do better in a structured discourse than other people, and I'm certainly someone who would do better in an unstructured conversation. Let the conversation go where it goes, and but other people are able to sort of capitalize on the fact that they only have a certain amount of time, and they have well rehearsed arguments and slogans. And I don't mean to disparaging when I say slogans, but I mean sometimes it is necessary to boil down a difficult concept into a couple of short sentences that are easy to drink in. And some people are really good at that. He's really good at that. I think you're quite good at that. I mean, and I mean that's how certain kind of memes get spread around in the great debate community, is with people who are skilled at that.
So, talking of slogans, I want to believe as many true things as few false things, probably the closest thing I have to a slogan, which I've noted many times, is me basically cribbing Hume on the foundations of epistemology, and this idea that the wise man would apportion his belief to the evidence, because there's a distinction, and you and I have talked about this before, between what someone believes and the reasons why, and whether or not it's warranted, and the degree of confidence that people have in it. And I have this very this definition of belief and knowledge that I will use a lot, which doesn't necessarily conform to the bulk of what epistemologists would say, where belief is just the acceptance of a proposition is true. Knowledge, being a subset of belief, is basically an expression of our confidence level. I'm not necessarily opposed to justified true belief as a definition of knowledge. I just think there's problems with it, and I don't think it's the way most people use the term. I think when most people say I know something, they're expressing, and this in part at least comes from you in discussions that we had surrounding the side debate, that they're expressing a confidence level. And quite frankly, their confidence level is irrelevant as to whether or not their belief is reasonable.
Yeah. This idea of knowledge as justified true belief is an artifact of Plato. There's a famous Platonic dialogue called the Theaetetus, in which they talk about what is knowledge, and they come down, well, knowledge is something that has three ingredients. You have to believe something to be true, it has to be true, and there has to be something that connects your belief to the truth, to the fact, and that has to be, that's what they call the justification condition. So there are three conditions: belief, truth, and justification. And of course, that is one definition. That's not even a theory of knowledge. That's a definition of knowledge, one of many that are on offer. And a lot of people sort of get hung up on this one, like it's the only one. But I mean, there are epistemologists who just completely repudiate the idea of knowledge. They just say that knowledge, it's just not a thing. What there are beliefs, and they are either warranted or not. Yes, there are true beliefs and false beliefs, but this thing called knowledge, there's no such thing. Now, I'm of the view that the word knowledge, go ahead.
Is it also the case? So we see these discussions about, is there any such thing as truth, or is truth truly accessible? Mm-hmm. We've got scientific models that don't make proclamations about truth. They're probabilistic. They are, subject to change and tentative. This denial of knowledge, it has to be tied into sort of a denial of truth as well.
No, I don't think so. I mean, truth is, as I would understand, well, I subscribe to a correspondence theory of truth. I think of map and territory. There's the landscape, and then there's the map. Okay, there's the belief, and then there's the fact or the state of affairs that's referred to by a belief. Okay, now, so if I have a belief, all a belief is. I mean, belief isn't a dirty word. I mean, a lot of atheists tend to be allergic to the word belief because they associate it with faith.
I had this conversation in an email this morning.
Oh, really? Yeah. And I think it's a mistake. I hear people say, I don't believe in evolution. I accept evolution is true. Well, that's what a belief is. It's accepting that the propositions of evolution are true. That's all that a belief is. But beliefs can be warranted, well supported, and justified, or they could not be. Right? And they're also just completely unwarranted, completely irrational, unsupported beliefs. Right? That I think is what we would term blind faith. Right?
And I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think that one of the key things that's been really useful in making this clear to people, like what happened this morning, is I can believe something, and it may or may not be true.
Right.
I can believe something for good reasons, and it still may or may not be true if my good reasons aren't actually sufficient. For example, the idea, I could believe that the sun orbits the earth because all observational evidence that I have at the current moment is that the sun goes around the earth. And so I have a rationally justified belief based on the available evidence that the sun orbits the earth, even though that's ultimately false. Mm-hmm. The key is to get to a better model of what quantity and quality of evidence is sufficient to reasonably warrant a belief, because we found out that we're wrong about the sun. You could also believe that the earth orbits the sun and it would be true, but if you believe it because your psychic network friend told you, then you don't have a warranted belief.
Yeah, well, see, this gets back to that business with psi. I mean, that first premise in his argument, right? What makes a conclusion or a belief rational is how you got there. It's not whether it's true or not, right? So, I mean, I know a lot of atheists who think that they are rational by virtue of the fact that they've come to this true conclusion that gods are nonsense and religions are all BS, and that therefore anyone who believes otherwise, the religious out there, are all irrational or systematically irrational. But of course, what makes a conclusion rational or irrational is not the veracity of that conclusion. It's how you got there. It's how you reasoned your way to there. You can have great reasons for believing a falsehood. You can be using all kinds of reliable strategies that just happen to go awry. You can be relying on testimony that is ordinarily unimpeachable, but in this instance is not good. And of course, you can the opposite can be true. You can believe something to be true for all the wrong reasons, and then, well, it doesn't matter that your belief is true, that you have a belief and it's true. It's just still not properly justified, and as such, it's still an irrational belief. But I think that, to get back to your question about knowledge and truth, you can have a very robust theory, understanding of truth. That truth is some state of affairs, and in relation to a belief. So, see, a state of affairs is a state of affairs. States of affairs aren't true. Beliefs are true. Statements are true. Sentences are true. Propositions are true. Right. A state of affairs is what makes a belief, a statement, a proposition, a sentence true, right? So think of states of affairs as the truth makers. They are what makes propositions and sentences and statements true, right? So we have to understand truth as relational. It's a relationship between a proposition, which can be expressed as a written sentence or a spoken sentence or a belief in your head, okay? It's a relationship between a proposition and the state of affairs described by that proposition, right? And when you have that correspondence, then we say the belief or the statement or the proposition is true. Now, that doesn't mean that there's such a thing as knowledge, though. I mean, it is possible to imagine a species of beings that has coincidentally true beliefs. I mean, or just imagine an individual who just wakes up one day with an idea, and it happens to, they happen to believe, they consult their magic 8-ball, and they decide it's going to be raining that day, and they should take an umbrella on the basis of the prediction of a magic 8-ball or something like that. Now, that is a very unreliable and silly way of arriving at your belief. There's no connection between the state of affairs that it will rain later today and the belief that you have, right? Your belief was just not occasioned, was not brought about in the right way. It was not the result of a reliable process, okay? But it's possible to imagine, hypothetically, beings that are systematically divorced from the facts so that they are never reliably connected to the facts. These would be unfortunate creatures. And so they would never know anything because they're never properly connected to the facts. If ever they have a true belief, it's by luck, it's by coincidence. If they have a false belief, it's equally by luck and coincidence. They wouldn't be in possession of knowledge. They would just occasionally have true opinions and nothing more. But I mean, the concept of knowledge it's an analytical distinction. The concern that people have who are skeptical about the idea of knowledge is, how do I know that I know? Well, wait a minute. Knowing that you know is a different proposition. If I say, what's that?
Because that's awareness.
Well, it's
equivocation.
But it's awareness of a different proposition. For instance, I'm aware that this is a cup. I am holding a cup in front of me now, right? That I am being caused to believe that there's a cup here. I didn't choose. I'm not deciding to believe that there's a mug in front of me in my hand here. I can see it. I can feel it. I can hear it. Okay. My belief is occasioned by the fact that there's a cup. Okay. Now, if that story is true, if it's true that I believe there's a cup, if it's the case that there is a cup, and if my belief arises in the right way, right, is caused in the right way by the fact that there's a cup, then it's justified. Then I would say I have a reliably produced true belief. I know that there's a cup here. Okay. But then you say, yeah, but how do you know that? Oh, well, now you're asking me not how do I know there's a cup. Now you're asking me, how do I know that I am causally connected in the right way to the cup, that I could have a visual experience that reliably represents the cup and so forth. Now you're asking me a question about my mental faculties, my visual faculties, and inferential capacities, and so forth. Now you're asking me, how do I know the answer to a different question? So when people say, how do you know that there's a cup here? Okay, that's different than do you know there's a cup here, right? There's proposition A. Here is a cup. I know that to be true, I would insist. But then if you challenge me on how I know that, you're now asking me to provide justification for a whole set of different propositions that are, I've answered the question. In my explanation of how I know there's a cup here, I answered why I know that there's a cup here. That is done. That question is effectively answered. And I don't believe it entails a regress just because you can ask me, how do you know? Now you're asking me, how do I justify proposition B? I answered how I justify proposition A. So, truth and knowledge are not the same thing. Knowledge implies truth, knowledge implies belief, and knowledge implies something like justification or reliably produced true belief or something like that, depending on your definition of knowledge. But even a person who would deny that there's such a thing as knowledge, okay, whatever the reasons, good or bad, you don't have to repudiate the concept of truth. Truth is this relationship between a proposition and a state of affairs that makes the proposition true. And you can accept that without ever going around saying we're ever in a position to know the truth. The truth can be the truth whether or not you're aware of it, much less whether or not you know it.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I've defined truth as that which comports with reality, kind of as a quick shortcut, the comparison of the map to the place. And I like talking about people who are confusing the map for the place. Yeah. I think one of the reasons, and I noted over in chat, I was saying, I think that that there are people who are more intuitively aware of this because of interactions they've had. For example, I'm a magician, and there are a bunch of magicians in the skeptic community. And I think that one of the aspects of this is that they understand, as magicians, it's their job to make you feel that your belief is warranted when in fact it's not. And so magicians are more likely, I would think, to understand that you can believe something which is not in fact true, and yet from your perspective, given the available information, certainly feels as if your belief is warranted. That being, the job description of the magician. I've said, and I think you'd agree, but you can comment if you don't. When we get into these discussions, oh, I don't care about belief, knowledge is all that matters, or I don't believe anything, and all this, we can have the discussion we just had. But I've pointed out that if somebody tells me that they know something, I largely don't care that they're expressing knowledge in any context other than they are expressing a belief. Because we don't wait until we have knowledge to act. We don't necessarily, as you were pointing out, you don't even have to have a model that includes knowledge. If you believe something, if you accept that something is true or likely true, and whether it's warranted or not, whether it's actually true or not, whether or not you count it as knowledge, this is going to inform your actions, and those actions have consequences. So telling me that you know something is, for me, saying, I really, 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 really believe this. And the definition of knowledge that I've used in discussions like this, just for clarity, is that knowledge is a belief held to such a high degree of confidence that it would be worldview altering to discover that you're wrong. And I think that kind of goes along with how most people would use it, even if they're not necessarily aware that that's what they're saying.
Yeah. I actually have a short video on my channel about certainty. I think it's called Bible Thumping Wing Nut Asks Me About Certainty, or something like that, where I talk about the uses of certainty and its connection or lack of a connection with knowledge. I mean, we use the word knowledge in a lot of ways. If I say, hey, do you know Bill? I'm not asking if you have a justified true belief of Bill's existence. I'm asking you, are you aware of Bill? I mean, Bill might not even exist. I can ask you, are you aware of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer doesn't exist. You're not going to have a justified true belief about the existence of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, right?
That brings up the issue of context too. I think people recognize that if you said, do you know Bill? You're asking, are you familiar with this individual? And if somebody said, do you know Rudolph? They're asking you, are you familiar with this concept that I'm pointing to?
Right. That's right. But we use the word knowledge in all kinds of different ways. But when philosophers are talking about knowledge, or when scientists are talking about knowledge, it's sometimes different. Philosophers have a tendency to be talking about this, something like justified true belief, or, as I see it, reliably produced true belief. But very often scientists, when they're talking about knowledge, what they're talking about is nothing like that. What they're talking about is a belief that is so well warranted, well corroborated, so well corroborated that it would be perverse to withhold your assent, right? And so you can provisionally assent to it and provisionally be confident in it, right? And here's a slogan that I've used a few times. Knowledge and certainly certainty will not give you anything that a well-warranted belief won't give you. That's what you really want. You want reasons to think that your map is accurate, right? That it predicts what you're going to see next, right? That when I crest this hill or round this bend in the river, this is what will unfold before me, right? The map will make these predictions. That is what a map is for. And we don't have an independent way of checking our map, right? You check your map the hard way. You look around at the world and you corroborate or you disconfirm the content of your map that way. That's all you've got. And the longer your map has served you, the more confident you're going to be. And this is partially rational, but I mean it leads to a problem. If you have a belief set and it's served you well your whole life, right? And that includes believing in some religion or some superstition or some political ideology. It can be wrong, but unless that a religion or a political ideology or superstition abuts against reality in such a way that you can discover that it's false, your confidence in that is going to continue to grow the longer you're living with it, right? Because you can always say, well, my religion served me well, my political ideology has served me well. And so what you want are well-warranted beliefs, and you want to be aware when your beliefs are well-warranted and when they've simply been along for a long time and never actually been tested, because they never butt against, evidence of your senses, or they've never been critically examined, and you've never sort of sifted through them for internal inconsistencies and external inconsistencies and so forth, right? So that is sort of something that people ought to keep in mind, is that well-warranted beliefs is what you want. Unwarranted beliefs is what you want to avoid. You don't want to avoid the word belief. Don't be allergic to the word belief. Everyone's got beliefs. Beliefs is just what you think is the case. If you think something is the case, you believe it to be the case. That's all it means.
I'm glad you got to this idea of well-warranted beliefs. There were a ton of topics that I had planned on potentially addressing. So maybe we'll end up doing a variety of hangouts, but I think we got to some of them in a roundabout way, but it raised this other question I think ties a few things together, because I was wanting to talk about, the process of discussions, what may or may not be convincing, and that's, perhaps too big for today. But to look at it from like a 30,000-foot view, I am engaged with my interlocutor who believes something and feels that it is warranted. I do not share that belief. I don't think that belief's warranted. We'll set aside the atheist, non-theist discussion for today. Although we'll note, for those people who had asked for this, that we are slightly in disagreement about which one is more useful, but not the facts of the matter. So now I'm in a conversation with somebody, and there's two things that can happen. Either we can agree on a path a methodology that would result in a reasonably warranted belief, in which case we then discuss the merits that somebody's offering for their case and show that it is either consistent with that method or it's not. Or we begin, or perhaps, as I've seen, a little more likely, rather than beginning with a disagreement about a methodology, once somebody has been cornered, they then alter an alternate methodology, or say that the path to reason that we thought we agreed on doesn't exist. I have this suspicion that, generally speaking, under almost any circumstance other than the particular subject on which we disagree, and I don't mean you and I mean me and the person I'm arguing with about religion, we do in fact agree on a basic idea of a methodology that would make our belief warranted. And it's only in these occasions of special pleading, essentially, about religious beliefs or superstitions, where maybe we've overemphasized personal experience or something else, that we one of us pretend to disagree about the path to warrant. How do we address this disagreement about pathways to understanding? Because you're either going to start there in some cases, or you're going to finish there unless you actually convince the person on behalf of rationality.
Yeah, that's actually really hard. I mean, that's the nub, right? Because the other person is going to look at you, right? A typical theist is going to look at you, and they see you as abandoning certain rational principles. I believe that something can't come from nothing, they would say, but you seem to be committed to the idea that something can come from nothing, whether or not you are. I don't mean to beg that question, but as they see it, they see you as engaged in special pleading, right? They think that you are departing from the sort of acceptable norms of reasoning that you use in every other aspect of your life, and that's why you're not coming to the conclusion that there's a God, right? And you might be motivated by certain other things, your love of sin or something like that. And it's really hard to get a person to do this. But I mean, one way to do this is actually change the subject, right? But okay, let's look at this principle that you're using. Let's see how this principle that you're applying would be applied by you and me in any other circumstance, right? And then hopefully they go, yeah, you're right. That's just an absolutely terrible way to proceed. I would never conclude X on the basis of this. In this circumstance, why am I concluding X over here just because it supports my dogmas, right? I mean, that is really the way to do it. And this was driven home to me when I was a graduate student, and I was a teaching assistant teaching philosophy classes. These were introductory courses in philosophy, and you'd be teaching fallacy theory. And one of the things that you do, of course, is you teach students, first year undergrads, name that fallacy. This is what the fallacy is. This is what ad populum is. This is what ad baculum is. This is what ad hominem is. This is affirming the consequent. This is denying the antecedent. You go through the fallacies. You give them examples. They learn what the fallacies are, and in no time at all, they get very good at playing name that fallacy. They get really quite impressively fast at going, no, wait, that was a fallacy. This is when you can get them in a conversation with each other, right? Discursively, which is the best way to do philosophy. And they get really good at saying, oh, that's an ad hominem. No, it's not an ad hominem. It's merely an insult. It's different. And then this is ad populum, and they get really good at that. But they get really good at seeing it in others, but they don't get very good at seeing it in themselves. And that's what's really hard, right? And one of the lessons of critical thinking is not just being able to recognize violations of our epistemic norms, of the standards of good reasoning in other people, but in our own belief set. But the best way to do that is to see, to take our own beliefs and apply the same pattern of reasoning that we're applying to something that we're trying to justify, and look at some other question and apply the exact same form of reasoning. But that actually requires a fairly high degree of abstraction. You've got to get people to think in terms of patterns of thought. Modus ponens, A implies B, A therefore B. That's called modus ponens. That's a rule of inference that everybody uses every day of their lives, and even if they've never heard the expression modus ponens, right? Or modus tollens, or disjunctive syllogism, and so forth. Most people never think in terms of forms of argument, the structure of thinking. And if you can get people to think about arguments not as particular arguments for a particular conclusion, but get them to generalize it and think more abstractly, then they can come to see that, some forms of argument reliably conduce to the truth, and others, they might not be true, and you can't rely on them. Those are the ones that we call fallacies. They don't necessarily bring about a false conclusion, but they don't necessarily and reliably conduce to the truth, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of people who don't have a good understanding of the definition or the distinction between validity and soundness.
Right.
The people that I come across who, in predicate logic, there's 256 syllogistic forms, and 16 of them are valid in structure. And this is something that some people would know and memorize, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's a familiarity with it. I think the best lesson, and by the way, logical fallacies can apply to both, tend to apply to structure, but also to content with regard to soundness.
Yeah.
Right? Formal and informal fallacies. And I love this idea of playing the fallacy game, of spot the fallacy. I agree with you that people are much far worse at identifying fallacies in their own speech. And I think this is also partly because sometimes we don't necessarily communicate what it is that we're thinking accurately, that there are shortcuts that we take in language that lead us to fallacies, even if what we're conceptualizing might be accurate. But I think the best lesson I learned from my wife, I used to come home from the show and she would say, stop saying argument from ignorance. Because the people that I'm talking to on the show don't know what the argument from ignorance fallacy is.
Right.
To them, I just called them stupid because their understanding of the subject is so marginal that it just feels like an insult. And instead of naming the fallacy, explain the fallacy with an actual example, and then perhaps give the name.
Right.
So this idea of spot the fallacy, name the fallacy, great for Philo 101 students, and should be good for anybody who wants to learn this stuff. Not necessarily the best thing to do in the middle of an argument. Yeah.
That goes kind of sort of two ways. Name the fallacy can often be done as a kind of shorthand to sort of divest a person, right, and try to discredit them. And one of the things that you often see is people just saying, "Well, you just committed this fallacy," and then you're left wondering, "Wait, I did? Wait, I'm not seeing it. Can you explain to me?" And then they'll say, "Oh, you don't know what the fallacy is?" Yeah, I know what the fallacy is. I just don't know how what I said is an expression of or an instance of that fallacy. Could you explain it? And if you can't do that, if the person's not willing to do that, then that they probably don't have such a great grip on what the fallacy is. They might just be pulling a move on you. But make sure that you don't ever do that yourself. I mean, I have heard people say that every argument for a God is an argument from ignorance, right? Well, look, that person simply does not know what an argument from ignorance is, to think that, right? And so one way to sort of get better at this and avoid this mistake of being able to effortlessly spot fallacies in other people and not in your own arguments is write down your own arguments, right? Very often we are so close to our reasons that we can't articulate them, we can't express them. They just seem intuitively correct. You know, people talk about, you know, well, it's self-evident. Look, if it's self-evident, it ought to be really easy to state, right? And the denial of it ought to be a flat-out contradiction of the form A and not A. It should be very easy to demonstrate things where the contrary is a logical impossibility, and where something is self-evident. That should be easy to do. So if you have an argument of you know, for or against a religious proposition or something like that, or anything really, you know, write it down and see and how many hidden premises there are. You will find very often that you cannot connect the dots between your premises and the conclusion, right? There's some kind of gap there, and in the course of trying to fill in that gap, you're going to either have to write in more premises to bridge that gap, or you're going to realize that you're going to have to write in premises that you don't actually endorse, that are dubious even to yourself. And then you're going to have to, at worst, oh, well, what's the big deal? I'll have to abandon that argument. You don't have to abandon your conclusion, actually. This is another thing that people think. A lot of people think that if they can't defend a conclusion, that they have to abandon it. Well, look, if we were perfectly rational beings, of course, we would not believe things on insufficient evidence, right? But usually when you discover that a belief has served you well, but you can't defend it, the thing to do is to say, hey, you know, maybe I'm not being rational, exactly, right? And scale back your confidence in that conclusion. You don't have to reject it. I mean, you can still accept it as weakly provisionally true, right? But that's the first step in belief revision, is recognizing, you know, I don't have such a hot argument for this.
This is one of the common problems with debates as well, in that it's predicated on the idea that if I can present an argument that you can't offer a defeater for right now, then in fact I win. I must in fact be right.
Right.
We know that this isn't the case, that maybe, you know, maybe I'm unable to come up with a response to it, or point out the fallacy, or show which premise is unreliable. Certainly, may be the case that I'm unable to do it on the fly. But we also have this intuitive thing that when our opponents present an argument and we think we've identified a flaw in it, and somebody remains unconvinced of that they're they're stupid. I mean, they just haven't got this stuff sorted out. And you know, that may or may not be the case. I don't think that somebody's inability to adequately defend a position tells us anything about the position. It may tell us something about that individual's justification for that, because I generally think that if you accept something and it is and you've done so on solid ground such that your position were warranted, that barring some extenuating circumstances, like you just cannot ever have a conversation with another person, written or verbal, that you should be able to offer some explanation of why you believe. I don't know. I'm not saying that this is necessarily absolutely true, because I don't think anything's absolute or possibly even true in that. I mean, certain, I should say. But I have a hard time with this idea that someone could have a belief, that they could have good warrant for that belief, and not be able to express what that warrant is, barring just an inability to communicate whether it, because I don't know that a good warrant could exist without some understanding of it. It's like people who tell me that they believe things that they don't understand. Like, I've had people tell me God is utterly incomprehensible to human beings, that we can know nothing about God's characteristics. We have no way of investigating it. And yet they still believe and still feel that it's warranted. And for me, by definition, there can be no warrant in that.
Yeah, I disagree with you there. But this comes down to a distinction in epistemology known as the distinction between externalist conceptions of justification and internalist conceptions of justification. So if I ask you, Matt, how do you know that there's a cup? How do you know, or why do you believe? Never mind, how do you know? Why do you believe that I'm holding the cup, right? And you'll say, well, yeah, I saw you holding it up. You were holding it up. I saw you drinking from it, for the last half hour or whatever. Okay, so there, you're able to give me a reason. You have consciously within your head, right? You can bring before your own consciousness the reasons why you believe, right? Well, I saw it. I heard you sipping from it, right? But sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes we are not able to articulate the reasons, even to ourselves. And I mean, just consider your dog, for instance. If you've got a dog, your dog knows when its dog dish is full of food. How do you know? Well, because it goes over and it starts eating from the dog dish when there's food in the dish, and it doesn't just start pretending to eat food from an empty bowl when the bowl is empty. Why? Because it can tell the difference, right? Clearly, it's able to make these discriminations. My dog knows when I've come home, when my car pulls into the driveway, and so forth. And don't get hung up on the word no. I mean, just my dog is aware. My dog has some true beliefs. My dog is capable of having true beliefs, right? But my dog could never articulate what these reasons are. It just doesn't have the cognitive capacities. Its brain didn't evolve to give expression to these ideas. And I don't mean that it just lacks language. I don't think my dog can express to itself why it believes what it believes, right? But I think my dog is capable of having true beliefs. Sorry?
That may be correct, but when I'm talking about this, I would agree that would be the case for dogs, but this seems to be a bit of a red herring, perhaps, in that when I'm talking about beliefs that are warranted, I'm only talking about human beings, and that
right. But
in order for there to be warrant, there seems to need to be some cognitive understanding of it.
Okay, but that's only I think if you define warrant as being something that is accessible to the agent, to the conscious agent in question, right? Whereas I think warrant has to do with how. See, you think of warrant as an internal matter. You're using warrant in a narrower sense, meaning reasons and causes for your belief that are accessible to you consciously, and hence that you could give and should be able to give expression to them to another person. Whereas in my view, I'm an externalist with respect to justification. I think that the concept of a warranted belief is a belief that is reliably produced, that arises in the right way. Either it arises through a reliable process of sense experience, or it arises through a process of reliance upon reliable testimony from people that are that have relevant expertise in an area or something like that. And so, in my view, having a warranted belief is simply having a belief that arises in the right way, whether or not you can articulate the mechanism or not. Right?
And I don't just mean articulate in the sense of necessarily be able to communicate it.
Oh, okay, but even to oneself, one should be able to reflect upon it, right? I think that's sort of a later evolutionary add-on, that we're able to think about the reasons, that we're able to engage in conscious inferential practices. I think people. So go ahead.
I would say that that's the substantive part that I want, that for me defines reason. Like when you say that your dog has, an external warrant for believing, whether or not there's something in the bowl, that I agree with regard to here's a belief and it is in accordance with reality, and the way the dog came to that belief is reliable. And but I think there's a distinction when we're talking about whether or not something is reasonable. When we're talking about we exercise from a standpoint of thought, beginning with identity, non-contradiction, blah 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 blah. That there's something extra, which we both recognize as difference between us and the dog. And because that something extra exists within us, this ability for self-reflection, this ability to discuss and think about this, that there is a secondary stage of warrant. It kind of goes with much power comes great responsibility, in that because we can reason better than a dog, perhaps we have a higher bar to cross before we should say something is reasonably warranted.
I don't think it's that we have a higher bar to cross. It's that there are leaps that we can make. That is, there are bars that we can clear that a dog can't. Okay. I agree with you that there are some things that need to be warranted consciously, that you should be able to articulate, if only to yourself, if not to another person. But that's because I think that there are true propositions that can only be apprehended via a process, a conscious process of inference, right? I mean, a gorilla could walk into the room and he could see that there's a table sitting over there, right? He sees the table, but does he see that it's a table? I don't think he knows that it's a table. He sees the table, but I don't think he sees that it's a table. There could be a twin cam engine sitting on my living room floor. He would come in and he would see the twin cam engine, but he doesn't see that it's a twin cam engine because he doesn't have the cognitive capacity to formulate that concept, right?
And I think that this is getting kind of specific, because if we just go with the dog with the bowl,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what concept is in the dog's mind, and I certainly don't want to get hung up on the language about a concept. But I would suspect that when a dog goes over to the bowl and is made aware that either there is food in there or there isn't, that I don't see how it could be the case that there's not some conceptualization about a distinction between a bowl that has food in it, a bowl that is empty.
Right, no, I think the dog has an experience, a visual experience of a bowl full of food. Okay, but think about inductions, for instance. Inductions are most people don't say, I saw a black crow, and then I saw another black crow, and I saw another black crow, and then there was that other occasion where I was over there and there was a crow and it was black, therefore all crows are black. That's not how people do induction. Most people do induction the way cats and dogs do induction. It's completely non-conscious. It's happening at the level of hardware. We can make it conscious, and consequently we are able to recognize the limits of induction and scale back our confidence in inductions, in certain inductions under certain circumstances, in a way that a dog couldn't. In other words, because we have certain cognitive capacities that allow us to make explicit the cognitive processes that are involved, right? Some of them are cognitive processes like vision and induction. Some of them are inferential practices where we're thinking about something like deduction and argument by analogy and stuff like that. These require language. These require the ability to represent a state of affairs to yourself, not just have an experience of a table, but be able to formulate the sentence, there is a table, what follows from that? That is a capacity we have. There's the responsibility, the added responsibility I think that you're alluding to. It arises from the fact that we have certain cognitive capacities that allow us not only to have just raw experiences, but reflect upon those raw experiences, not just make inferences, but recognize that we have made inferences and evaluate the process by which we arrived at those experiences. And that itself becomes a process, right? And so there are inferential practices that we have as opposed to processes, right? Dogs, I would say, just have, inferential, they just have belief-forming processes, but they don't have any inferential practices. We have both. Now, when it comes to the question of sort of God's existence, look, that is, I submit, is not something that you just experience, although some theists would try to insist that you can just have an experience of God. I would challenge that. But in any case, if you believe that God is a Trinity, look, you don't just experience that God is a Trinity. If you believe that Jesus died for your sins and your only path to salvation is accepting him as your Savior, that is not just a feeling that you get. That is a proposition. That is a doctrine that you hold to. That is something that you have to think about, and that presumably you arrived at that through a process. You were told by a person who you trust, who has not been in the habit of BSing you your whole life. They're teaching you something that's supposedly important. They tend not to lie about things that are important. Therefore, you trust them, and that's the process, right? Sort of confidence in a reliable authority, right? We can evaluate those things. So just going to finish the point. The fact that we have not just reliable belief-forming processes, but we have reliable belief-forming inferential practices is the difference between us and some other species. And I think these are going to belong along a continuum. I think these are things that slowly evolve. But consequently, in my view, warrant is something that encapsulates both. It's not just the stuff that you're conscious of, which is how we got onto this.
Okay, well, so I think we're once again we are largely in agreement on the facts. It's more about how we choose to label or think about it. Because if I were to imagine that I were able to communicate with a dog at the level of a dog. I can't tell you whether or not a dog would understand anything conceptual such as why do you believe, and then it could respond with why do you believe. But I don't think that it's an unfair assumption to presume that if I could communicate with a dog that way, that it would in fact have a concept like that. Because if I said, why do you believe there's food in the bowl? Or better yet, like, we can take it a step further, because dogs can tell whether there's food in the bowl, nothing in the bowl, or something inedible in the bowl.
Mm-hmm.
So they clearly have these distinct concepts. And I think that, if you could communicate with the dog, you'd say, why do you think there's food in the bowl? And the dog would just say, because there is. Look, it's right there. And while this is a very simple, it's not distinct from why do you believe there's a cup. I agree there. The only thing I'm saying is not that I think that we have a greater capacity and therefore can explain further. It's in the case of the dog, if I were to ask him, why do you believe that there's food in the bowl? The dog would say, it's right here. It's you can look at it. I can taste it. I can see it versus empty. I can smell it. I don't know that they can necessarily communicate those concepts, but they have to have those experiential differences. There's a different brain state for rotten food that they might love and rotten food that they don't love.
Right.
And in human beings, I think the same thing is the case. When somebody tells, what I was arguing against is essentially the dog saying, I believe there's food in the bowl, and I believe that there's no way to tell anything about what's in the bowl or not. That is the distinction I was trying to get at.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Actually, just a quibble here. I don't think you could ask this sort of hypothetical. If we could talk to a dog, I think the problem is that the gulf between us and dogs is such that we could not ask the question in a way that they could understand it, and it has nothing to do with language. I just think that dogs can't formulate questions. Period.
So but two dogs can communicate.
Oh, they can communicate all kinds of things to them, but there are certain things they can't communicate. There are certain things you can't communicate by virtue of not having language. I can communicate that I believe that this is a cup. I can also communicate that I believe that this is a cup, and I can also communicate that I believe that this is a cup. And, through several iterations, although a dog could believe that this is a cup, or that the dog food bowl is full of food or something like that. There are certain things that language affords us. Right? There's certain thoughts that you can have only by virtue of having language, right?
Let me see if I can, because I think we're just like right on the cusp of something, and we're really going to want to wrap up in a minute. If a dog came up to another dog that was starving, mm-hmm. and coaxed it to follow it to food,
mm-hmm.
and this is kind of behavior, we see this in animals on occasion sometimes.
Yeah, sure. There's all kinds of altruism. Yeah.
It would seem to me that this demonstrates that not only does the dog have a concept of food, but it has a concept of a dog perhaps in need of food.
Sure.
And can find some way to communicate that the food is there. And now we're just talking about degrees of communicating this.
Right.
I'm fine with the idea that the dog not only has several warranted beliefs in that case, but that it may not understand that those beliefs are warranted. It may not have the concepts of matter of fact, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have concepts of warrant. It would just be intuitive. But I'm fine with the dog would never, if you were another dog, make any sort of case for mere intuition. It would be pointing to the thing.
Yeah.
Obvious. It would be, of course, hard solipsism isn't true. Here's your bowl.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's what it comes down to. Here's what I agree with. I don't think that a belief can ever be rational and warranted unless some account could be given in principle, right? So it's different. That's different from saying being able to give an account in practice. Look, how do I know that I'm seeing a cup? Well, I'm relying on my memory, that my vision has served me well in the past. And, I'm relying on the fact that my senses are generally reliable. I'm relying on the assumption that I'm not in a circumstance where I could be vulnerable to a systematic illusion. I am relying on the assumption, bare assumption, pure article of faith, that I'm not dreaming this right now. I mean, I could be. I might wake up and feel like a fool for having, said this, but I mean, I'm assuming that I'm not dreaming, right? Any claim to knowledge, any belief operates within the scope of certain assumptions. Some of those assumptions will be just blind articles of faith, like I'm not dreaming right now. And some of them will be warranted assumptions, like my memory has served me well in the past and stuff like that. Okay. But I mean, I think that our belief in induction is ultimately not warranted without circular reasoning. I think that my trust that my memory is itself reliable is, I mean, how could I test the reliability of my memory without, in the act of testing it, exercise my memory to make sure that I'm testing the right thing that I think I'm testing for, that I set out to test? I mean, exactly. Right? So look, rationality rests upon assumptions, some of which can be warranted and some of which are unwarrantable. Okay. And that is something that we shouldn't be sort of terrified of. I mean, being a good skeptic and a good critical thinker is knowing where the limits of reason end, what you can justify and warrant and what you can't. You can't give a deductive argument for why you should use deductive. That's circular reasoning. You shouldn't ever give an inductive argument for why you trust in induction, right? That's circular reasoning, right? And we don't have a deductive argument for why you can trust induction and so forth. We need to understand the limits of rationality. Rationality can, in fact, and I would insist, does rest on some unfounded, unwarranted assumptions. But that's not a license to believe any old damn thing. Look, reason itself could rest on what are sometimes called properly basic beliefs, beliefs that are unwarrantable in principle, except on pain of circularity. But that doesn't mean that you can believe any old damn thing. Look, we have reason. Reason is what allows us to sift through a lot of nonsense. It's just that, reason is the ladder that we're standing on to reach true beliefs and avoid errors. But you can't use that ladder to get to the ladder that you're on. It doesn't work that way. And so where I would agree with you with respect to the whole dog thing is, I don't think you can say that a belief is rational and warrantable if in principle you could never give a good reason for it, right?
Yeah, no, I'm in agreement there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this some people don't like to hear this, but I think it's rather hard to deny that all of us take some things as pure articles of faith. That we just, no one taught me to trust my memory, and no one taught me to trust in induction. No one taught me that I had a self. No one taught me that there are causes and effects. I mean, this is just part of our animal heritage that we as organisms benefit from. We just have this. This is built into our brains. It's how our brains think, and this forms the structure that permits rationality and scientific reasoning. But it doesn't work very well when you try to use it to justify itself. You end up arguing in a circle, which I should not do.
I would say that I'm in near complete agreement on that as well. Apart from the fact that I'm going to avoid the use of the F term, just to avoid confusion. The way you're using
right.
I'm in complete agreement. And this is the thing. And I guess what we're getting to is we have a fear of uncertainty. And when we realize that we live in a world where certainty isn't necessarily attainable, may in fact be impossible, there are some who want to, or who are unavoidably led to the conclusion that therefore anything goes, that nothing can be justified, that there's no good reason for anything.
Right.
And it is perhaps one of the foundational fears that religions play on by, in many cases, offering the illusion of certainty, which, by the way, even if they were able to offer certainty, we as limited beings in our failed reasoning could never confirm, in fact, that it was certain. It would require the sort of knowledge of, it would require certainty to be able to demonstrate it.
Yeah.
And given that being the case, I instead of talking about faith, say that, I have reasonable expectations based on past events, or that I have trust or confidence, and I talk about, the warrant in it and everything else. But I've also noted that I do have presuppositions. And if you would want to call those faith-based, I still object to the term, but only because of how it is used elsewhere, and I'm wanting to avoid confusion about it. But on that note, there's I think we've opened the door to about 20 more topics.
Yeah.
and sorted through quite a few. I want to tell everybody as I wrap this up, and I'll edit this and get it up tomorrow. Thanks everybody for watching, and thanks Ozzy for agreeing to do this. I'll put a link up to Ozzy's channel, because I would think that if you value my thoughts on these subjects, it would seem reasonable, and I may have a warranted belief that you would also value the thoughts of individuals whose thoughts I value. And Ozzy is extremely high on that list, and he has a bunch of content up at his channel that'll go into this in much better detail than we're able to do just sitting down for an hour or so. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.